Good morning. So good to see all of you here this morning. We're glad that you're here with us today. No matter what has brought you here this morning, whether this is your first time here or your 100th time here, whatever it is, we're happy that you're here. We're happy to share in this time of worship together. When I was first starting out here, in fact, I think it was during my first month after I'd graduated and started preaching here, I was given this black binder of sermons as a gift. And I haven't written a sermon since. No, that's not true. I do write my own sermons. But it was a really thoughtful gift, a nice gesture, and it was especially important or significant to me because of where these sermons came from. I didn't know him at the time. I didn't know his name before, but these are the sermons of a man named Preston Cotham, whom I did not know. I hope I've said his name correctly. But some of you may know him. I'm seeing some nods in the crowd. Longtime preacher, and actually spent several years preaching here at College Hill many, many years ago. And so you can see what a thoughtful gift that was to me as I started out here. And I'm very thankful for it, not just for the words here, but for what it represents. This little black binder is a person's life, or at least their life's work. It is a collection of that weekly joy and weekly struggle of trying to say something that matters, that's true to God's word, to the people of God. And not just that, but the people of God right here at College Hill. It's a special thing. And it's an encouragement to me, an encouraging symbol to me, I think. And I hold it up this morning, especially on a week like this one, when for me the process of writing this sermon was a lot more struggle than it was joy. We're continuing in the story of Abraham this morning, looking to his life. And as I've been reading through the story of Abraham and I've been thinking about his life, I've been hoping this week and looking to his story several times, reading through it several times this week, hoping to find something to say this morning about faith. After all, that's what Abraham is known for, right? His faith. But the question that keeps coming back to me as I keep coming back to Abraham's story, the question I keep struggling with is Abraham really all that faithful? Is he really the model of faithful living that we often make him out to be? Have you ever wondered that before? Of course, we began his story last week in Genesis chapter 12. We began with that calling of God to Abram when God says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." And we talked about those three fateful words that changed Abram's life. So Abram went. And it's at least clear to us that in this first moment in his story, it does seem pretty clear that Abraham is acting out of faith. He's leaving this land that he knows for this land that he doesn't know. He is holding on to this promise that he can't see, trusting that one day it will come to being in him. So that's the first 4 verses of Abraham's story. But the story goes on from there. In fact, in the book of Genesis, there's about 14 chapters that are just about Abraham and his life story. It's about 30% of the book of Genesis, 370 verses about Abraham. And as I read those 370 verses or listened to them in my car several times this week, kept coming back to that question, struggling with it. Is Abraham really all that faithful? I mean, is this the guy? Is he the model that we hold up and say, this is what faithful living looks like? Because sometimes as I come back to this story, I think maybe he shouldn't be. Sometimes when I come back to this story, I think maybe Abraham shouldn't be the poster child of faithfulness. Maybe he shouldn't be the guy on the Wheaties box, champion of faith. Abraham's life may not be the best example, I wonder sometimes when I look to it. After all, we haven't gone very far in his journey when we see this. Abraham goes to Egypt because there's a famine in the land. And there he says to his wife Sarai in Egypt, he says, "I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they'll say, 'This is his wife,' and they'll kill me, but they'll let you live. So say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life will be spared on your account." Well, lo and behold, when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that she was a beautiful woman, and the woman, Sarai, was taken into Pharaoh's house, presumably to become one of his wives. And for her sake, Pharaoh dealt well with Abram, gave him sheep, oxen, donkeys, slaves, camels, the whole 9 yards. Now think about what's happening here. Abraham has just lied about his wife and effectively sold her for a profit. I mean, and you know the story of how the Lord intervenes here and how he afflicts Pharaoh with plagues, and eventually, Sarah is brought back to Abraham and all is well again. But you got to wonder, what was Abraham's plan if God didn't intervene like he did? What was Abraham's plan if, at this point in the story, if God doesn't step in like he does? Does he see this as a chance to move on from his barren wife onto someone else who can fulfill the promise better? Or is he just out of his mind scared and makes this terrible plan? Either way, we can agree that this is a terrible plan, and it's a pretty poor reflection on Abraham's character, right? And what's worse, of course, is that it happens again. In chapter 20, Abraham this time is in Gerar, and while he's residing in Gerar, Abraham says of his wife, do you remember this? "She's my sister." And King Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah, presumably to be his wife. And again, the Lord intervenes and he returns Sarah to Abraham. And again, Abraham gains from all of this. Verse 14, Abimelech took sheep and oxen, male and female slaves, gave them to Abraham, restored his wife Sarah to him. Abimelech said, "My land is before you. Settle where it pleases you." It's not a very pretty picture, is it? This is not even close, I don't think, to how we would expect the faithful man of God to act. Not once, but twice, Abram in this story lies to protect himself and throws his wife at another man and then gains from it. In fact, he may have done this even more than twice, as the story suggests. In this same chapter, he's talking to Abimelech in this chapter after he's been caught in his lie. And he tells him how at the beginning of his journey with Sarah, he asked her, "This is the kindness that you must do for me," Abram says to Sarah, "at every place to which we come. Say of me, he is my brother." At every place, it seems, they have been doing this ruse together. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time with this. This is a troubling thing to me. And yes, it is true, technically, that way back in this time when it was more accepted, Abram and his wife Sarai are actually half siblings, and so I guess you could say that he's telling the truth. But it's kind of like when you're a kid and you tell your parents that your brother's nose is bleeding because he fell, and you don't tell him that he fell because you pushed him. Not that I ever did that. But it's a manipulation of the truth, and we all can see it. And when you see it, it's pretty off-putting, isn't it? And then there's that whole deal with Abram and Hagar and Sarah. When Sarah and Abraham decide, well, if we can't have a child, well, then Abraham ought to take Hagar and have a child with her. And so he does. And they have a child named Ishmael. Before long, things start to get frustrated between Sarah and Hagar. Feelings start to get hurt, starts to get kind of awkward. And before you know it, Abram casts Hagar and Sarai out into the wilderness. Not exactly your Father of the Year move. Not exactly your model of faith move. It's troubling when you look to the story of Abraham and you don't really like what you see there. That's the place that I've been in all week, looking at this story with this question: is Abraham the model of faithfulness for us? Because some of the things he does are really troubling. And some of the things that he does, I have every intention of standing before you today and saying, don't do that, as if you ever would. None of us would. And I grant that so far I've mentioned only the worst parts of Abraham's story. And I get the fact that Abraham lived in a time when he didn't have God's collected wisdom bound up and written and given to him. And I understand that Abraham is, in a sense, a product of his time in the same way that all of us, by some degree, are products of our time, like it or not. But man, some of these things that he does, they really trouble me. And yet, although we may not see the ideal model of what faithfulness looks like in Abraham, I do think that we can learn a great deal about faith from him. In fact, I think that we can learn a great deal even from the failures in his faith. Abraham may not have always been a good model for what faithfulness looks like, but he is a real one, a real model. Someone who, through many false steps and many false starts, did struggle toward that single promise. Someone who I think that when we really get down to it, believe it or not, we may relate with quite a lot. After all, we can relate with Abraham. We can learn from Abraham. Because all through this story, it does seem like Abraham really does believe what God has said to him and trusts that God is worthy of his trust. It's just that sometimes he doesn't quite trust enough. And as much as I'd hate to admit it, I can relate with that. Because in Abraham's life, at times, it seems like there's just a disconnect between what he really believes to be true deep down inside of him and what he feels in the heat of the moment. There seems to be a disconnect between what Abraham knows in his heart of hearts is true and what he experiences in the present tense, in his current situation. And so when Abraham is in Egypt with his wife, even though he knows and he believes the promise of God that God will protect him and that God will prosper him, in the moment, he just can't see it. In the moment, he just has a hard time seeing how he can possibly get out of this place alive. He's blinded by the worst case scenario. He's blinded by his fear. And so he flips out and he makes this ridiculous plan. And even though my stomach turns when I see the thing that he does in this story, I must admit that I can relate with being in the moment and only being able to see the worst case scenario. I can relate with being in the moment, and even though there's that thing that you believe deep down in you, sometimes in the heat of the moment, it flees and you abandon it. Because Abraham does believe deep down. If he didn't believe deep down in his heart, he wouldn't have gone on this journey at all. If he didn't believe deep down in his heart, he wouldn't have continued on this journey. That's what Hebrews tells us when it says that if he had been thinking of the place he left behind, he would have had opportunity to return. Deep down, Abraham believes. But at times, he flips out. At times, he fails to see it. Sometimes he looks down at his hands. He traces the wrinkles on his skin. Sometimes he feels the droops beneath his eyes. Sometimes as he gets out of bed in the morning, he feels the ache in his bones of his old age and of all of this journeying. And sometimes in those moments, though he believes deep down, he just loses it because he can't see it. He just can't see how these hands and these bones and this body could ever be the father to the son that God has promised him. And so at times like this one, Genesis 15, he cries out to God, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless." I'm getting old, God. And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. It's a servant in my house. It's not my son. Because he just can't see it. Not in these hands. Not in these aching bones. Have you felt that way? Have you been there before? Like even the thing that you know deep down, even the thing that drives your whole life begins to fade because in the moment, you just can't see it. I think I can relate to Abraham. Not specifically with some of the things that he's done, but heaven knows I've got my own personal history of looking at these two hands and looking out at the world and seeing in it just a world that is thoroughly unpromising and just not being able to see it. Not seeing how God could work in a world like this one or in hands like these or in a person like me. I can relate with that feeling. Can you? Have you ever felt like that before? I guess the question this morning is this then. Does that make Abraham unfaithful? Does the way that Abraham acts in these moments of crisis, these moments when he loses sight of God and God's plan for him and he flips out and he changes course, does that make Abraham unfaithful? And the answer that I've struggled all week to find to that is maybe. They could. Those moments could make him unfaithful. But I think it really depends on what happens next. What happens next in his life? What happens next for Abraham? When he's flipped out and he's lost sight of the promise of God, what happens next in his life is what makes all of the difference for his faith. And time again in this story, what happens next in Abraham's life is that he returns to the promise of God. He returns to the path. Yes, it's true. Abraham at many times wavers, but he keeps coming back. And what makes the difference for Abraham, and what makes the difference for you, and what makes the difference for me is what happens next. What happens next in that moment of crisis in your life? What happens next in that moment of disbelief? Do you return to the promise of God? Do you return to the path that God has given us? Do you get going back in the right direction, journeying by faith? Because if we can learn anything from Abraham, I think it's this. It's that even when we have moments of crisis in our lives, moments of despair, you can always come back. And when you come back, you find that the promise of God is still there waiting for you. Because God is faithful even when we're not. I love the scene in Genesis 15. We just were there a moment ago when Abraham has just had his crisis moment. He's looking at his wrinkled hands and he's losing hope. And the story says that God somehow, some way brought him outside. I know it's just my imagination, but I imagine at this moment God placing that wrinkled hand in his, pointing it up to the stars, saying, look toward heaven. Count the stars if you're able to count them. So shall your descendants be, God says. God says, my promise is still there for you, Abraham. You have not outlived your hope. The promise is still for you. And in this moment of crisis, what happens next? Abraham believed the Lord, verse 6 says, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. The story of Abraham is certainly one of many ups and many downs. It kind of reminds me of the story of Peter we spent all fall talking about. It's a story of many highs and many lows. And I can feel the frustration in me as I look to his story sometimes, the things that he does. But if we can learn anything from Abraham, I think we can surely learn this. We can learn that through many false starts and through many false steps, Abraham doggedly pursued the promise of God. He didn't let go, even in the moments when he couldn't quite see it. To borrow a phrase from a writer, Eugene Peterson, Abraham's life is a long obedience in the same direction. Not perfectly so, surely not. But Abraham does find those moments that he needs to look to the stars, to remember the promise, and to believe again. My question for you this morning, what happens next for you? What happens next for you when you have those moments that we all seem to have? Those moments when your life goes off the rails. Those moments when, try as you might, you just can't see it. You just can't see how you can get out of this struggle with sin that you're having. You just can't see the hope and the promise of God. You just can't see the way forward in your life. What happens next for you then, in those moments? My hope is that you'll do what Abraham does. That you'll return again to hope. That you'll return again to faith. That you'll come back to the promise of God, even in those moments when it's so very hard to see it coming to fruition for you. Close this morning with a few words from this black binder of sermons here. It's from a sermon that Preston Cotham preached about faith. Great Faith, it was entitled. The language of it is a little bit dated, I think, but I think that what he says is very true. He says, great faith is strong enough to surmount any obstacle and so persistent that it yields to no rebuff. Sometimes the obstacle that we face in our lives that must be overcome, I think sometimes it's ourselves. It's our own weakness, morally or physically. Abraham deals with both of those in his life. But God is a God who sees the strength of the weak and failing and restores it when they believe in His promises and follow Him. As the words of Isaiah say, those who wait on the Lord renew their strength. They'll soar on wings like eagles. They surmount every obstacle. They run and don't grow weary. They yield to no rebuff. They walk and do not become faint. Let's hold fast to that hope and that promise as we go from this place this week, knowing that even to our weakened faith, God can give wings. As we close this morning, as we've been doing the past several weeks, we'll have our elders and our ministers at the doors as we leave. We're going to sing a closing song and have a short prayer. And after that is completed, if there's something on your hearts this morning that you'd like to have someone pray with you about, then we are here for you. And of course, the invitation of God is always open to become a Christian, to be baptized into His name. We offer that invitation this morning. Let's live as faithful people this week. Let's express our commitment now as we stand together and as we sing.